Welcome to
Welcome,
Half Brain.
Half Heart. Welcome to Half Brain and Half Heart, where healing and growth meet at the crossroads of science and soul. So I'm really excited today to be talking about how to build inclusive spaces for the LGBTQIA plus community, especially when it comes to wellness and just overall support. We know that this is a community, like many other marginalized communities, that experience such disparities when it comes to general, I think, health, but especially in the mental and emotional wellness. And Dr. Adwoa, I'll tell you kind of what prompted me to want to have this conversation and spend time kind of talking about this was I was you know me, I'm always going to bring in the like kind of pop culture or what's going on in the world and today. And I don't know if you had seen this, but there was a news caster or reporter by the name of Jason Hackett, and he works in in Minneapolis area, and he was sharing. Pride is coming up; it's almost June, and he was sharing that he was going to be on the cover of LGBTQ plus magazine cover, and was super excited. And in that, and this is on air, he made this, he kind of, I think, and using his maybe words, is like he formally kind of came out of his glass closet.
Hmm.
He said, for the most part, people in his immediate kind of circle, his life, his family, friends, were aware that he was a gay man, but he had never, I think, said it on camera, right? Said it live, and so this was his moment to kind of come out and share in a very public way. And the support that his co-anchors gave him, and the pride that they shared in him doing this and taking this moment was very beautiful. But it made me think about the pressures that people of this community experience to have that moment, right? And I always think about, for people who don't identify as queer or might cisgender or might be what we call straight, um, there's never that expectation, right? There's never this moment of you have to come out, you have to announce, right? I feel like there's this added like emotional labor of this, of the queer community to, why didn't you tell us, right? Like, when are you going to come out? There has to be this moment. And I think that it's similarly, I think when you think about communities of color, where there's this pride and like kind of claiming some of your heritage and your history, that the queer community has done that with this idea of coming out and announcing it. But at the same time, I just think about again, the emotional labor that it creates for them. And so, yeah, so just kind of thinking through all of that and having such a mixed reaction, which is, not really for me to say because I'm not Jason Hackett, but it just made me think, and like, what an opportunity to have a conversation about just wellness, about the emotional and mental support, the presence of inclusive spaces, and really truly understanding and maybe having questions, or maybe having thoughts and opinions, but and how do we have those conversations while not necessarily centering ourselves, but also kind of giving the space for those that are a part of this community. So that was a lot, I think, to introduce this conversation. So I guess maybe I would just open it up to you to say, like, when you think about inclusive spaces for, especially around wellness for the people that identify as queer, what have you seen, or what's been your experience?
Well, I think the story that you shared and all the stuff that you added to it in terms of this expectation of coming out, right? And the stress around that, the so much thought and planning and stress, like right there is a need for support. Right? anybody that's going through that, worried about their parents and being rejected and what will that mean for them, and or keeping this secret so that they don't get kicked out of their homes, like all of that stress. And you're right, stress that cisgender, don't have. And so such a need for support, and not enough support. I mean, there's not enough support for, I think, any marginalized community. Not a single marginalized community gets as much support as they need. Uh, However, there are great places, like there, happen to be fortunate to live in New York. Right? So in New York, there are multiple LGBTQIA plus community centers, and a lot of them especially focus on youth, like teenage, that time when there's a lot of angst, figuring space to figure things out, and to have that support, and if families don't react well, to be able to have some place to get resources, housing resources, whatever resources are needed. So I think we're really fortunate that in New York, anyway, we have a number of LGBTQIA plus community centers that really focus on wellness, and they generally focus on holistic wellness, trying to, if they don't have all the services, at least connect people with services that are welcoming, right? Because
Mhm.
there is accepting, and then there's welcoming. Like,
Yes.
we welcome who you are as a whole, and whatever challenges that might come in particular because of who you are as a whole, we welcome you. And that's a lot different than, okay, you're accepted here. You're
Acceptance, and this is a word that gets under my skin, tolerance.
tolerated.
I
Yeah,
think we've, in the last few years, moved away from the use of that word a lot, but it just made the hair on the back of my like neck stand up, because it's like, who wants to be tolerated? And
okay,
also, who are you to say that you are tolerating
exactly.
whatever I am bringing to the table? Um, so I agree with you in that New York City offers, or New York offers a lot of support and resources. But I also feel like, and maybe this is, my own work that I have to do, while I know that they exist in theory, I
Hmm.
don't know that I could point exactly where. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, and I think that's part of also the challenge, um when it comes to this idea of inclusive wellness, and it's like, it's not at our fingertips, or it's not at the tip of our tongue, the way that it might be for other situations, right? If I were to say, if somebody said, like, where do I go to, you know X hospital, or whatever the case is, to service a more wider spread, and to your point, not for any marginalized community, but just any, like a general kind of um mass audience, like, thing, I know where to direct them. But if somebody were to kind of express some need for support that is culturally competent, I don't know that I would have that at the tip of my fingers. And so I think that in and of itself is part of the challenge as well, that it's the emotional labor, but now it's like, I've got to, go through Google, or I've got to, like, talk to friends of friends of friends to figure out which is this resource or space or community center that is skilled and reputable in supporting this. And I think, while that's an amazing and great thing, it feels like it's bare bones, like it's not enough.
And it's heavy. But I think of this again. We're talking specifically about the LGBTIAQ, I've got a Q in there, plus community, but I find that the same holds true for many marginalized communities. As a Black woman, all the time, and as a doctor, people are always asking for references to Black OGBYNs, right? So that
Mhm.
they have somebody that is culturally competent and understands. Um, and I do think it's unfortunate that these things can't just be on the tip of our tongue, but I think it's so fortunate that we do have the internet, because we just think about this. And my early days in this work was with the HIV positive community. So I started my professional career working with the LGBT, it was just LGBT community then. We didn't,
Mhm.
then we got the Q,
Mhm.
um, in my early times, but working in the community that's where I started my work. So I worked in an organization that housed people who were HIV positive, drug addicted, and it was an organization founded by a gay couple, and it was very, I guess, very welcome, not welcoming. I mean, yes, welcoming. Like this was the agency really catered toward the LGBT community. In fact, the LGBT community was the majority, and everybody else was the minority in this agency. So those days, we did have our resources because we connected with each other, but it was really, you gathered them. Like, so as soon as you heard of an organization, you made sure that you had that so that you could pass it on. There wasn't Google to
Mhm.
search as easily then. And so I think there is something wonderful about being able to, in the privacy, like I can ask you, but I can also now have the agency to search Google myself and look at what this agency says and make an evaluation. And I don't have to just rely on somebody telling me that they're good people. I can kind of do some checking. I can do both. Where before it was just the only way to know was you kind of had to ask, or you had to be vulnerable enough to step in and know that you might be rejected. It might be a bad experience, but the only way to find out was to walk in there. Now we
Mhm.
have a better idea from like websites. One of the things that's really important to me is that my website has inclusive pictures, that I have pictures that represent the LGBTQIA plus community, people in wheelchairs, people, with vision loss, like that. It's as representative as possible so that people can feel seen and welcomed. And that is something that we can look for when we go to the web, and something that we couldn't as easily assess before.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely recognize the maybe growth or the evolution, maybe is probably a better word, of resources and how and the ways that we're able to connect to those resources. And it's a thing that I'm very grateful from, like you said, from the idea of the queer community, from marginalized communities, from uh disabled communities, all of those things. And I guess there's this deep-seated desire in me of like, yes, and right. Yes, and like there's so much more opportunity that we have. Um, and especially in thinking about and even just having this conversation, I think sometimes we get caught into the if you are not a part of that community, um what right do you have to like kind of inquire or have conversations or be a part of maybe even the solution, or am I leaning too much, or it's not my problem to solve. And I think again, one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this to this platform and to have this conversation is because I think that as a steward of community and creating community, you have to lean into some of these conversations. You have to be open to hearing other perspectives, and maybe sharing a little bit of like, hey, right here, right now, this is how I'm thinking about it, or here's all the kind of complexities that are running around in my head. Let's have a dialogue. Let's talk through it. So I think in that vein, I would love, from your expertise and the work that you've done, what are some common challenges that I think the queer community it faces in maybe, today's world, accessing inclusive spaces, or just like even just the health, I think, and wellness challenges that this community is experiencing.
Great question. And before I answer that, and I promise I'll answer it, and if I don't,
I'll
ignore
bring it
me.
back.
But as you were just talking in terms of like, why should we have these conversations, and why is this important, and why should we lean in even if we don't identify as being a member of the LGBTQIA community? And as I was thinking, as you were saying that, about how, especially all marginalized communities, right, we are stronger if we work together. And if this medical office, right, doesn't welcome LGBTQIA, then kind of don't feel really welcomed either. I need it to be a welcoming space, right? And an open space. Uh, for example, I remember going with my best friend, taking her mother to an eye doctor's appointment. And we walk in, and there is one of the nurses there with, I think, can't remember if they had on like black nail polishers, something that was a little edgy, and maybe purple hair or something like that. And I remember thinking, yay, like this is so wonderful that we're at this doctor's office, and the expectation is not that this person needs to take this nail polish off. This is an eye doctor's office. They, like, and people wear gloves, so like there was no need to. If anybody else could wear nail polish, why couldn't this person wear their black nail polish? They were neat. They were clean. They were in, the hospital, the hospital greens or whatever it is that nurses wear. They were in the appropriate uniform, but it was so there's something that just made us all, when we walked in the first time, it's like, yeah, so if this person is welcome, there's a good chance that we will be welcome as also members of a marginalized community. So I think it is important for us to lean in, because when one group is pushed out, like that just increases the chances that we're going to be pushed out. And when one group is pulled in, invited in, it also starts to open the door for others, even when there are, special differences, and every marginalized group deals with slightly different issues. It's still nice to know that it also makes it easier to have the conversation. Once that conversation is broached for one group, then it often makes it a little easier to start to have the conversation for other groups. Often there's exceptions.
It's there's something about like, I think what you're saying, or how I'm interpreting it, is that when you see that, you recognize that there is some level of compassion, or, maybe you expect a level of compassion. And so when you think there's compassion for this person who is not always tolerated, accepted, or welcomed, then there's a high likelihood that, like you said, that others will be accepted and that others will be welcomed. And so there is that exhale, I think, when you go into these spaces and you see, oh, it's not the cookie cutter, one size fits all model in this eye doctor's appointment, or in this yoga studio, or in this, whatever clinician's office. When you start to see different images on the wall, and I think that's why representation is so important, right? Representation from not just the marketing or advertising perspective, but just who's also doing the work,
Yeah,
who's
yeah. So I
positions
think
of power.
exactly. So getting back to answering your question, I think representation and welcome, being welcoming is so extra important. I mean, it's important, I think, in any space. I think if you walk into a department store, you should feel welcome, right? And if you don't feel welcome, then you shouldn't spend your money there. But I think it's especially important in any wellness space, because every single wellness space, when you enter, you're entering at your most vulnerable, right? Generally. So if you go to a gym, right, you're going to the gym to get healthier, get leaner, right? There's some vulnerability there. If you go to, certainly if you go to a medical doctor's office, right, you're going to take your clothes off. You're going to, right, they're going to be examining you, even if they're examining your eyes, like getting that close to you, there's vulnerability there. If you're going to a therapist, you're sharing, you know, your thoughts that you probably don't share with, some of them you don't share with anybody else. And so there's a lot of vulnerability. In order to be vulnerable, you have to feel comfortable. And if you think this is going to be a space where you're guarding yourself against discrimination and microaggressions, you can't be fully vulnerable, or it's harder to be vulnerable. It's harder to trust the care that you're getting if that's the case. So when spaces are not welcoming, there's a higher chance of discrimination and microaggressions and all that stuff. And therefore, your guard's got to be up, and it's not as wonderful. And then when we talk about medical again, definitely special medical considerations might be needed for LGBTQIA, depending on what's going on, to be knowledgeable of that, or at least to be open to be educated,
Mhm.
is so important because uh, there are so many special considerations there that are hard enough for the person to, like, they've grappled with it. They may not be sure, or they may be concerned about how they're going to be seen, to welcome them in their fullness with all of, whatever choices, and understanding that this person, like, this is who God made them as, and these are the choices they've made. Because there's both aspects, and to welcome them as a full person is so important, so that they can get the support that they deserve as a human being. I guess, bottom line, if we can focus more on people being human and bring our empathy and compassion to them, that'd be great. But many places don't have that. They don't have the representation. Representation is so important because there's just things like, I don't know what it's like to be somebody that lives in a wheelchair.
Mhm.
I know some from the work that I've done, but I don't actually know what it's like to get on a plane. This just came up, and my husband was, I don't even remember how this came up, but just realizing, like, the bathroom in the plane is not wheelchair accessible, right? So what do you do? What would you do if you on I can't even imagine having people who understand and having that representation there, make sure that the space is welcoming, right? That's part of, so somebody can say, okay, well, did we consider this? Right? I might not be able to think about that and consider it because this is not my everyday experience. But when we have the representation, then we invite more of thinking about that. And then training also, like having the training about some of the special needs. Like, these are all the things that welcoming spaces make sure that they have, to make sure that there is some training on what might be some special needs, and uh, how are pronouns changing. And there are always so many changes, we can't keep up on everything. It's just not, it's also not unreasonable to know that people, like, things change so fast, and sometimes it's hard to keep up on everything. But knowing to be open to being educated also is so important, and to know that I don't know everything. But when somebody feels like, okay, well, you don't know it, but you're willing to hear me, you're willing to hear me out, or you're willing to go get the education yourself. Like, once this comes up, it's like, okay, so now there's a new thing. So let me go find out more about it so that I can be welcoming. That attitude is felt. And that is what we want to really try to make sure that people feel the love and support and empathy, and not judgment, right? Which is the opposite.
There's so many things that I should have been writing down notes. I was trying to tuck them away as you were talking. But there's so many different elements or some different avenues that I think we could take this conversation, and probably like so many other topics that we can do, podcasts on in the future.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm trying to think of where I even want to kind of go. But I think there's such an interesting piece around what you were saying of, and even when I said, representation, why that's so important, because your lived experience is different from my lived experience. And so, for somebody who uses a wheelchair, and as somebody who hasn't, yeah, I might not think about that, right? I was talking to a friend the other day, and she's, working on, I think, renovating the office space in a building. And the question came up, well, is the sink, I think, because it's in a kitchen, it was like, is it at a level where somebody who uses a wheelchair is able to, put their dishes in or wash their dishes or whatever the case? Is it accessible for them, basically, right? And it was one of those things where it's like, oh, should have probably should have considered that, or should have thought of that. I didn't. And I think that's the piece of why it's so important to have people with different lived experiences at the table to have these conversations, but also acknowledging that doesn't excuse or give permission for someone to not challenge themselves to think about that,
Yes.
right? So, yes, you may not have thought about it in that moment, but
Mhm.
now that you can now, in the next situation or in the next conversation, say, you know what, I had this experience, and you know what, this was a miss in when I was working over here, or when I was working on this project, now I should be thinking about this, or now, so I think ultimately, like you said, it's this willingness and openness to learn and to kind of grow and say, yes, this might not be my story, this may not be my experience, but that doesn't mean that I can't help to advocate for that in that moment. And I think, as a DEI leader, that is often sometimes the rock and the hard place that I think people, especially in organizations, get into, where it's like, well, I'm not, you know, disabled, so I can't speak or I can't advocate. I can only support this person that's talking.
Mhm.
Or the only way I'm going to think about it is if there's somebody with a disability in the room that can kind of put it on the table. And I think there's definitely this balance of, yes, have representation, have the, different voices in the room, but also exercise, become educated, learn, ask questions, be inquisitive, so that you can contribute beyond what your own personal experience is.
Yeah, I love that. And the importance of us to be willing to step up, even when be willing to step up and step up in a way that is, I can't find another way to say it, loving and appropriate. So if we're thinking about this renovation, right? And okay, nobody in the room uses a wheelchair, but to ask the question, have we thought about this? Right?
Mhm.
Because I may not have all the answers, but even if I know that this is something we should consider, even if it's not my, so let before we make a final decision, let's go find somebody to ask. Let's do some research. Let's find out. Again, we do have the ability to find out a lot more. Let's go find a way to get this information, but you have to know to even ask the question, and
Yeah.
you have to be willing to be vulnerable enough to say, well, no, I am not a member of the differently challenged community, but I know somebody, I've read a book, I know something, and I know that we should probably be thinking about this in some way.
Mhm.
I don't know exactly how, but let's at least put it in the room, put it on the table. Let's start to do some research and think about how to do this, as opposed to just, this is it, this is enough, and we've done enough.
Well, and I think what I will challenge anyone who's in this space, in any space, right? Anyone who's alive, right? To recognize that your experience is not the only experience. Like, if you just operate in the world that way,
Mhm.
that there is no one singular truth or one singular experience, and the one that I have lived is not the same as you. I mean, look, we share identities as Black women, as Black professionals, but your experience is not my experience. And so if we can just as individuals operate that way and be inquisitive and just say, like, my way is not the right way, my way is a way,
Mhm.
my way is a way that has maybe benefited myself and the people maybe around me, but that doesn't necessarily mean the same. If we can just really hold true to that, I think that almost automatically kind of opens up this door of, wait, is this the only way to see something? Maybe we should have a deeper conversation, or maybe we should, like, brainstorm, or whatever that may be.
What you just said is so important, but I want to emphasize how difficult that is for some people. So for many people, right? So hard, because it takes knowing yourself, being confident in who you are, and grounded in who you are, and willingness to be vulnerable in order to do that, right? Because it's much easier, at least it feels much easier to individuals, to like, this is it, this is the way that we've always done it, this is the way we're always going to do it, to not change. It takes a lot more strength to be open to looking at other ways of being, and it's unfortunate, because a lot of what believe it or not, some of what I do in private practice with people is to, well, have you thought about it this way? Like, people come and they've got their story, and this person, oh my gosh, this is such a departure, but trust me, it's on this. I remember way back in the 80s when there was a whole big thing in Brooklyn, New York, between the Korean grocers and the community. And some of it had to do with Korean grocers wouldn't put the money in the person's hand. They put, I think, put it down the counter,
Yeah.
or the other way around. But it was really it was a
Hmm.
cultural miscommunication, but it was seen as disrespect.
Yes.
And if people were able to ask the questions, right, and be inquisitive as opposed to make assumptions, which is what we do when we don't want to see other people's perspectives, when we think the way we know is the right way, right? If the way you know is the right way, then you have been disrespected if somebody doesn't put the money in your hand. If you're curious about, well, like, what's going on here, and you understand it's a different perspective, and another culture might have a totally different way to do it, which is not disrespectful at all. And so I think it's the same thing here, is that to be willing to be open, but that takes, some strength. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I hear this, and hear that, and I also recognize that this is probably my own bias and my own like narrow view, because I get it, and I it makes complete sense, and I think part of the challenge of it is you're trying to explain or excuse, or just kind of create some understanding around situations as they occur, as opposed to this kind of cultural shift of just always being curious from the very beginning. Do you know what I mean? Like, um I love that example, because yes, absolutely, I could totally see myself thinking, well, I mean, I handed the person the money. Why won't they touch my hand? Or what is that about? But it's almost like in my head, I'm like, but have we gotten too far? Right? Like, because now you're asking someone in that situation um to be inquisitive when there's so many, it's already charged. It's already, there's so many emotions evolve in this in the moment. Um and again, I think I totally recognize it's my bias of how I was raised, of just being inquisitive about everything from the very beginning, so that now in those moments, one, I actually might not, I might already know that's a cultural thing,
Hmm.
right? Because it's not, I'm trying to understand the immediate issue.
Right.
It's, I've been exposed, or I've read, or I've learned in school, or I had friends who were of different cultures, and I asked about those things, or I noticed those things. And I think it goes into, and it goes back into the representation. It goes back to like having a foundation of being curious. I think it goes into again, just not having this understanding that like how you understand and how you see things may not be the only way to see it. And I again hear that it is, unfortunately, I think not enough of us are kind of raised maybe, or like, brought up in this idea of community, as opposed to as the individual lens, right? The community lens as opposed to the individual lens.
And I think you're so right. And I think some of it, I'm hoping, okay, and I'm not the social media person at all. I don't pay attention to any of that stuff. But I like to hope that, because what you just described is kind of having a worldview mind starting from young, because you were either surrounded by people of different cultures and experiences, so you had those conversations naturally, or you were well traveled, so you got to be experiencing other cultures and communities, or were learned in school, which we know they've been trying to minimize that, but there were ways that you were exposed. So if the younger you're exposed to different cultures, different ways of being, different stories, then the more your brain is open to, my way is not the only way. I'm hoping that one of the good things that's come out of social media is easier access to world culture, to things being different in different places, and other people's experiences and stories, so that people who, where I grew up, there were some people, especially people who were impoverished, that never left the borough, right? Never went from Brooklyn to Manhattan, which you can walk between the two, right? So all they knew was very, very small. And therefore so because of lack of experience, if nothing else, it's hard to imagine other ways of being, other ways of thinking. But now, with everybody being able to see so much, and there's, so many things I have trouble with in social media, but one of the things that I think is a real opportunity is that it's not as hard to find out what life might be like in Korea. We've got we've got Korean whole streams of Korean TV that gives you more insight into the culture in a way that is easily accessible to people, where you don't have to now get on a plane. And I think that gives us an opportunity to see that there can be so many differences. And I'm hoping that that is part of what's happening for younger people. And it seems to be. I mean, it seems like youth, because of social media, are more open to LGBTQIA things, open to mental health things. But then I also think there's some backlash. But anyway.
And and I just to kind of wrap up that piece of this conversation, I think, yes, exposure and access are huge factors in how people approach, differences and get excited about it. I also think if I were to kind of put that into one bucket, I think the other bucket is just, again, helping people to understand from a very young age. And I think there's so many reasons for why why I kind of have this view. Maybe it's also because I'm the third born, right? And so it's like I know that there are other people at the table who have different, feelings, different emotions, and all these other things. So I do think there's this part of exposure and accessibility to the larger world and to different seeing it and touching it and feeling it and talking about it. But I also think there's this way of kind of um, raising and challenging each other, of just thinking about it from a more of again, a community lens of just like, even if we are all the same, right? Again, you and we're both Black women, but also just saying, but you're not Dr. Adwoa, right? You don't have her experiences. You didn't grow up in Brooklyn, you grew up in Virginia or wherever that, and just understanding that there are multiple ways to see things. There's multiple views. And I think even if I don't know what your view is, or I don't know what the view is in Korea or for the LGBTQIA plus, just even the awareness that my view is not the singular view,
Mhm.
I think is something that's huge. Because to your point around social media, I do definitely see people being exposed to more, but I also see a lot of people being just as judgmental and just as you know, damning and demeaning of people who are doing things differently, because that's not what I know, and what I know is right. So I
Mhm.
think it's a little bit of like you want to give exposure, you want to give accessibility, but you also have to do that work of, just because you said it so is not so, right? Um, I want to just kind of bring us back really quickly to, one of the questions that I was asking, we were talking about are like, what are some of the things that are challenging for the LGBTQIA plus community? And I think you were talking about, you know, service side and treatment size, but aside of it. But I also want to just spend 2 seconds just talking through. And I think we could do a part two and like more conversations, but I would love just, acknowledging that because of a non-supportive and welcoming kind of environment, and because of some of the hardships that come around with being a part of that marginalized community, there is increased um, um, numbers of mental health or challenges when it comes to depression, when it comes to anxiety, suicidal ideation, because they're in an environment often where it's not welcomed, it's not even tolerated, right? We said that we don't like that word, or I said I don't like that word, but it's not even tolerated. And so there's a higher rate of that because there's the lack of social support.
Yes.
There's a lack of familial support, and there's the stigma and discrimination and the fear and all of those things. Because of that lack of support and the fear and the stress, there could be increased substance abuse
Yes.
because of that kind of emotional lack thereof emotional support. um, there is higher rates of chronic health conditions, because again, if you aren't um, emotionally and kind of mentally taken care of, that shows up physically, right?
Yeah.
We talk about that all the time.
Yes.
How stress can become um, heart disease, can lead to heart disease, that can lead to not the best eating habits. And then let's not even talk about whether you have access to it, right? If you are stressed and you have anxiety and you have depression, there's discrimination, you're not necessarily having the jobs that you might need to provide for yourself and your family. So there is now an increased situation of homelessness, housing in security. So there are all of these other challenges. I think that when it just comes to general wellness
Yeah.
for marginalized groups, but specifically talking today about the LGBTQIA plus,
Hmm.
that even gets them to the need of having a safe wellness community and space. And then you get there and it might not be you're like hit or miss sometimes, right? If it's not someone that's specifically identified to support or that is open and welcoming to that community. So I just wanted to kind of call that out because I think that there's two sides of this issue or this conversation of one is like what are people experiencing that is impacting their own wellness and their health, and then also might challenge them in actually seeking out support.
I'm glad you emphasize all that. And it reminds me of some research, and this is relatively old research, because at least 10 years old. And of course, I don't have the reference right now, but I was struck so much by this research that I really remember it. Research that supported that if young people who identify as transgender are supported by their families, that they grow up without some of what we see, and for a while was thought to be concurrent, that people who were transgender also had other mental health conditions, right? But those other mental health conditions probably caused or exacerbated by the
Yes.
rejection, the stigma, right? And that
Mhm.
when children from the beginning are supported in love for who they are, that they can grow up and are healthy and happy with themselves and transgender. Right? So I thought that was groundbreaking research, that to see that these things, because for a while, psychology is a soft science and things change all the time. But for a while, psychology was really kind of merging these things unfairly, that people who are transgender also had like serious mental health conditions. And that doesn't, which is not surprising to me at all, which is why I was so happy to see this research. I was like, yes, this makes perfect sense to me, that knowing that you were born in the wrong body, that your brain is wired as one gender, but your body is shown up as another gender, has nothing to do with mental health. These are two different things.
Yes.
To do with anxieties and all of these other things that are mental health concerns. But if the person is not treated with love and is rejected because of this difference, then of course we're going to now develop anxieties and depression and all these other serious mental health concerns.
So, we talk about education, what we're exposed to, and I think that piece, if that piece of like, here's how we used to look at things, here's the evolution, like even that moment, even that distinction is so critical. Because it just like you said, it just makes so much sense. Like previously, oh, if you're, if you identify as homosexual, if you identify as transgender, like you're more likely to be on drugs, or like I think with that, whether it be through science or whether it just be through society, we've kind of made these incorrect connections and
Yes.
links between these things when it's like if you're black you're going to be poor, you're going to be that, it's those aren't, they're not
Yeah.
proven links. It's all of the other things around it. And so yes, if I'm not loved, if I'm not given the foundational care as a child, of course there might be some other issues that show up, or there might be challenges, or the likelihood of having those challenges increase rather than thinking that one is the cause for the other.
Yes.
So I think that's such an important thing to call out, and it should hopefully drive people to have a little bit more compassion and show a little bit more support, because we know the power behind that. So I would love to kind of wrap up this conversation with, I guess, maybe just one question for you. Given your experience in this arena as a clinician, what do you think, or what do you hope to see for wellness professionals and community leaders um, to help drive a more inclusive space for people that are a part of this community?
Well, I think it all starts with these kinds of conversations. Being open and willing to have the conversations to accept what we don't know, so that we can then look for the training, look for the opportunities to learn more. But I think it starts with being willing to have the conversation and understanding that the conversation is important. And so that's what I ask for, I guess, everyone in the wellness field. Get more curious, and curious about how you can show up to be a better clinician, a better fitness coach, a better whatever you are, to all the communities that you service. Get more curious about how you can do that so that you're truly welcoming.
Love it. Dr. Adwoa, thank you as always for an amazing conversation.
Thank you, Monica. We always, I mean, we could go on forever.